I seriously believe that Max Verstappen's mind is not in a good place right now. Not because he's mad at Oscar or at Red Bull, but it's more to do with the FIA itself. Because I feel like he's now having to put a lot of time and effort into managing that and being strategic, and that's not great when you're trying to defend your title. Some might assume Verstappen was fuming at Oscar Piastri for holding his ground around Jeddah. You know, getting a taste of his own medicine, as some people would say, but I really doubt that. Well, I mean, if you looked at the post-race press conference, one of the more verbose answers that he was giving had nothing to do with the 5-second time penalty. He was putting Oscar on a pedestal and respecting his efforts and really rating highly the guy that he has actually been rating for quite some time. This was just yet another example of it. No, this video goes into something a little bigger than that, as to why Max Verstappen is acting the way he is, and the real reason behind that little conversation he had with Mr. Ben Sulayem. In my honest opinion, Max is walking a very narrow tightrope which could, with one more toe out of line, see him thrown off it, imposed with a one-race ban, and effectively ending his championship run, or at best, make it unnecessarily harder to overcome. Once the Austrian Grand Prix has been completed at the end of June, by the way, I am going to be attending that race, so if you do see me, say hello, some of those points will disappear and he will have a little bit more breathing space. Whether or not it means that we might see him get a little bit more colourful with his language remains to be seen. Until then, there is no wiggle room when it comes to bold moves or sharp words. Kinda might be explaining why GP on the radio was going like, yep, no comment, Max, no comment. And now I've had some time to stop and think about it, I think that this is more nuanced than just saying, oh, well, Max has just matured, simple as that. No, this is going a little bit deeper than that, that maybe Max is trying to convey to the world in his own way that he doesn't agree with what the FIA is doing without actually saying it. So this is a really big strategic mind game that he is pulling against the governing body of Formula One, and so far, it's working, because people can't stop talking about it. I'm talking to you about it right now, and Max has not had to say a damn word about it. Now, yes, he is maturing in some capacity because, you know, he's getting older. That does usually tend to come with added thoughts and words of wisdom, you know, something of which Charles at the moment has an inexhaustible supply of. But in this case, it's different. Max Verstappen's sudden economy of words is not a clear-cut signifier of a mellowing champion, but the byproduct of a rulebook that now punishes plain speaking almost as harshly as a jump start, the FIA's new misconduct rule that came out in January. It could bring 6-figure fines, point deductions, and even bans for anything said or done that causes moral injury to the FIA's image. For people like Max, it's practically a legal minefield. With the Australian Grand Prix being the first F1 race since Appendix B was added, Max has had to tread very carefully to make sure that nothing is misconstrued as moral injury and that he keeps his words clipped and professional and also not come across as petulant. It's just minimal. That every post-race microphone could easily lead to jeopardy, especially since the competition was stiff right from the get-go. No 5 or 6 race buffers that he had last year, and of course at Jeddah he got that 5-second penalty that effectively cost him the win, since he wasn't able to run away from Piastri, who managed to peg the gap to at most 3 seconds before the first pit stops. In the FIA's defence, they did show some leniency once I took a look at the actual document and read the reasoning behind this 5-second penalty, that because this was a lap 1 racing incident, that it wasn't the standard 10-second penalty, but 5. Can you imagine the backlash and the furore had it been if the 10-second penalty had remained in place? Afterwards, he then answered each question concerning the matter with a knowing smile and the line, "It's better not to talk," as well as others. This act of restraint crystallised a broader tension between drivers who trade on authenticity and a governing body determined to impose corporate-style messaging discipline. But I also think that Max is also walking the line in this regard, because it only takes one steward who now feels emboldened to enact their own concerns and analyses that maybe Max's verbal gymnastics could possibly be leading to moral injury of the FIA, because we are talking about it. The FIA is being seen and conveyed by the media in a negative light, potentially. And at that point, I think that Max would just go, you know what, I'm out. Bye! Bye! However, these new rules, they've really been a long time coming when you stop to think about it. Back in August of last year, Sulayem primed the change by urging stewards to show strength against any high-profile remarks that incited abuse toward officials. In short, Hungary 2024 and the fallout of that. Those remarks were also in tandem from 2 seasons of wrangling over many amendments that barred unapproved political or religious gestures. In fact, you could easily argue that what was going on with the FIA and Mr. Sulliam, Sebastian Vettel just took one look at it and was just like, this is not for me, thank you very much. And that really took some balls, because he must have known what was going on in the wind tunnel and the simulator with the 2023 Aston Martin, that it could potentially be a good one, that it could lead to several podiums, maybe even a cheeky win, and Sebastian still just went like, nah. But going back to Max Verstappen for a moment and the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, I think that this race weekend was the first example of us seeing this brand new, more measured Max. The first instance where he was being imposed a penalty of this kind. Afterwards, he offered no analysis or outrage from himself, merely insisting that people look back at the footage and let that speak for itself. And Christian Horner did just that, showing printouts to the press instead. Now, I bet you when Toto Wolff first saw that, Christian Horner holding some printouts, he shed a tear and said, "Ah yes, now finally Christian's talking sense in a way that I can understand. He printed it out, he has it." In fact, I was looking at an article from The Guardian, and this kind of makes me think that maybe Max Verstappen was using Christian Horner as some kind of mouthpiece, in a way that he wouldn't get in trouble, and Christian Horner, being the spin doctor that he is, could frame it in a way that looked like he was pleading Max's case indirectly. The Guardian also describing Verstappen's press room near silence as calculated civil disobedience, pointing out that he aired the same grievances privately to his team, setting the stage for, of course, that dossier-heavy approach to appeals amongst the court of public opinion. Because that is the thing, because Red Bull did not file an appeal for that 5-second time penalty, because they probably knew that wasn't going to wash. So at the time, I think it was a shrewd move, but from what I've seen in comments and across many other websites, I don't think it landed the way Christian hoped. Thought Red Bull and Verstappen, if only Oscar Piastri didn't keep his left tyres on the track. If he'd gone off the track at the same time, Max might have gotten away with it. Might have. Or Oscar might have gotten the time penalty himself, and therefore the time penalties were cancelled out. Or maybe because of the time penalty, Charles Leclerc would have gone on to win the race. How about that? His social media reflected the same approach. Just photos, generic captions, no veiled digs. No soapbox moment from him. Compared to the sharp, meme-worthy soundbites we've come to expect, it was stark and calculated. Now, I bet you're wondering about those visuals and whispers that the FIA president apparently confronted Max after the race and told him to hush, most likely sparked by a Park Fermé video clip and photos, since the press were there to capture the post-race interviews. Now, I can understand why some people might think this, because the FIA and Max, they clashed many times before, the body language seemed quite interesting and curious and not exactly friendly, but according to various other reports and eyewitnesses, the conversation didn't really seem to be giving off means of Max being told, you better watch your tongue or you're going to get more penalties, and it seemed like maybe it was just typical chatter of like, oh, sorry about that, hard luck, mate, and then simply it ended like that. Now, that's all very well and good. It might have just been completely innocent chat, but at the same time, perceptions matter. The optics matter. Max looked somewhat guarded, then Sulliam looked somewhat confrontational. So therefore, people are going to interpret that in many different ways. It did not look like a friendly meeting. So therefore, it would fuel the theory for a good long while that Max was being muzzled. In fact, that was my first conclusion. Now, whether or not that meeting had real teeth, or was indeed just typical pleasantries, Verstappen's caution after that is far more easily explained by institutional pressure and thinking outside of F1 itself. He's already been pinged several times for colourful language, some believing he's been made an example of due to his status as a multiple world champion, and known for his blunt takes on matters. And also, like I said, Max is fully aware of what's going on with the F1 rulebook, since he seems like he's been reading it cover to cover multiple times to make sure of what he can get away with and what he can't get away with, most notably around Austin last year with his tangles with Lando. He cannot afford to get in trouble because he might get a couple of penalty points and then he could be put on the benches, and therefore he could kiss bye-bye to a fairly reasonable and fully controlled by his own volition title defence. Also, there is the matter of external influences in the back of his mind, because you've got to be paying attention. He is also a brand ambassador of Heineken, and of course you've also got to remember the sponsors of Red Bull, most notably their title sponsor, Oracle. They would naturally prefer a clean image to reflect their corporate values, and yeah, Max swearing isn't anything new. But in recent times, with it becoming a major source of headlines and debate which can sway toward the negative side, I doubt that these companies would want to be dragged through the mud by mere association. Max is not dumb. He knows the game. Yes, I know he is a multi-millionaire, but at the same time, you know, having that income coming in, it's nice to have. So I doubt he wants more negative attention. Himself again citing that social media, it fuels the fire. So quite honestly, I hope that this video can maybe sort of try and dampen those fires a little bit. I get what Max is trying to do here, so if Max, you are watching this video, I hope that I'm trying to get on your wavelength perhaps, and just give me a sign. However, is all of this self-censorship a matter of policy? Well, not officially. Of course, the FIA has made no secret of its guidelines and denied the existence of any individual gag orders, but as multiple analysts have pointed out, the real effect is chilling. The vague messages of Appendix B, moral injury, insults, penalties for speech, it creates risk without clarity. Only recently, after the Australian Grand Prix, well, during that weekend, the FIA came out with some kind of clarification to say that, yeah, no, okay, you don't have to worry about the radio. You can swear there because it can be monitored and vetted and maybe censored in due course. Because Oliver Behrman made also a comment that he cannot afford to swear on the radio or somewhere else, that the new drivers, whose salaries are far less than some of the mainstays, including Verstappen, they'd be seriously affected. So therefore, you can easily say there is no need to impose gag orders because, well, it's already happened. There is already a de facto muzzle on all of the drivers because this ambiguity has led to this culture of fear that, oh, I better be careful, I don't want to say anything bad that might get me in trouble. According to the GPDA, many drivers were blindsided by this introduction, and mistrust is growing, with George Russell recently lamenting this turn of events, that the actions of the letter from the GPDA, they had unintended consequences, and at this point the battle may as well have just been lost. Now, I can also imagine that, oh, none of this is true, that Max is just a sore loser, that, as you mentioned, he got a taste of his own medicine and he didn't like it and he decided to cry about it. But to understand Verstappen's silence and behaviour is to realise that it's damage control, not just whining about being defeated. It's not who he is who's changed, it's just the way that the sport punishes these kinds of things. And when you look at Max's past comments when he didn't really have to worry about what he said over the radio, including Portimao 2020 toward Lance Stroll, you realise that all of what he's doing right now, it's not just something that's strategically related, although it is a big component, it's also an existential moment, maybe an existential crisis for him. He said for years that if F1 stops being about pure racing, he'd walk away. We know this. And the imposition of these rules is just yet another splash of water on the competitive log pile that keeps Max's F1 fires burning. And I'm pretty sure that at the moment, that fire is getting dimmer and dimmer by the weekend. And sometime soon, maybe without warning, that fire could easily be just put out. No amount of money or glory or influence could ever possibly reignite it, at least within Formula One. But as of now, even though there are plenty of rumours swirling around regarding his future, there is no real absolute concrete evidence to really just project the thought that Max Verstappen is about to leave the building. As of now, Verstappen is staying in the sport. Because Red Bull's car, it continues to have its moments of brilliance, because the money and recognition still flow, and because the thrill of winning, it still outweighs the hassle. Even though a couple of years ago he did say that he liked winning by 20 seconds over, tight competition. But the scales are tilting, and eventually they may tilt so far that everything for him falls off. Let's not forget, the FIA also has influence on the regulations for the car itself. Not from Mr. Sulliam necessarily, although he is wanting those V10s, but from the likes of the single-seater leader, Nicholas Tombazis. Max has regularly said that he does not like where these regulations are going, even though there have been changes since his initial comments that have made the experience somewhat more palatable, including rumours that maybe the emphasis on electrical power may be reduced for the race, so that means the cars don't potentially reach their limit during a straight and then they have to lift and coast or something like that, which is just absolutely bizarre. Can you imagine that down the Mexican Grand Prix straight? My god. But that's the kind of thing that would really touch many of Max's nerves. Something of which, in earlier iterations, Max jokingly mused that what would come next? Red shells? Bananas? Mario Kart on the brain, clearly. I mean, the new track in Kidia with its 20-story high ramp reminds me of a track from Mario Kart for sure. But in any case, these new gimmicks, they could and are souring his competitive faith in F1. And let's not forget the fact that the calendar at the moment is really approaching overload. Then of course you've got sprint races to consider that he's really not a fan of. Okay, Law, that's all very well and good. You're trying to paint a picture that Max Verstappen is trying to find a strategic way to get around all of the red tape the FIA has been consistently adding. So, okay, if he reaches a point where he's just had enough of Formula One, where would he go then? The FIA has a huge sphere of influence. And that is a very good point, because the FIA has shown recently that it interprets its own code differently in different circumstances. Sometimes harsher in F2 than in F1, punitive in WRC, but then lenient in Formula E. It feeds off of the perception of selective enforcement and thusly makes the FIA out to be incredibly erratic. So in a way, it really adds a chilling effect as to the importance of Appendix B, probably one of the most infamous documents in the FIA's history. Max Verstappen chooses to basically say nothing and have one-line responses because he's not quite sure where his comments would land within the appendix. Then of course there's Mo, who got slapped with a swearing penalty and that was deemed as misconduct. But then you look to what was going on in Formula E with Dan Ticktum. He went on an absolute tirade. But the moment I heard that had happened, I was like, oh Dan, oh you're in trouble, more trouble than when you called Nicholas Latifi poo. No, didn't get a penalty at all. What? It therefore means that interpretive gaps could be had depending on the steward. The rule is broad enough to follow a driver into most FIA championships, yet porous enough to look inconsistent from one paddock to the other, fueling rumours of manipulation even where none may exist. Then it just makes you think about WRC, F1, they're more prestigious series, so those drivers need to be made an example of. Formula E drivers, oh yeah, they're not relevant enough. I mean, what does that say about the sport, eh? Because you've only got to look at a Formula E race and go, oh my god, it's absolutely bonkers. And although I did touch upon that there are meetings being had with the drivers in private to maybe seek some clarification regarding swearing on the radio, this kind of stuff needed to be done sooner after the GPDA letter came through, because the GPDA's action instigated that appendix, so you could never see the GPDA make one of those letters ever again, because it could easily fall foul of that appendix, and with all 20 drivers supporting it, all of them could be slapped with a €40,000 fine. But be that as it may, the World Endurance Championship and Le Mans are the top of Max's wish list naturally. He has constantly mentioned that endurance racing is something that really tickles his fancy. I can also imagine that for a start, the far less packed calendar would be a lot more appealing. Sure, there are fewer races in the World Endurance Championship calendar, but at the same time, they can be grueling when it comes to preparation. But you get the sense that Max wouldn't mind that, because you look at all of the stuff he does virtually, the months of preparations for all of those virtual races, oh, that would be absolutely his jam. This is just a Tuesday for him. Then there's Verstappen.com Racing. That's entering GT World this year, and he's openly discussed a future hypercar entry with Fernando Alonso, and jokingly Yuki Tsunoda if they can make use of his low weight and height. But those series too are under FIA oversight. The rulebook would follow in there, albeit with less eye-watering fines. IndyCar and NASCAR may not fall under the jurisdiction of the FIA, but Max has not really gone on the record to say that he's interested in IndyCar. NASCAR doesn't really tickle his fancy, it's just not for him. And retirement, therefore, does seem like a genuine possibility, that he would just go, you know what, I'm just sick of racing in general, I'll just go and do something else for a while and then see where I fall. Because, as he said, he's not prepared to emulate Fernando and be around for 400 races. He's got his sim racing, he's got his GT project, he's probably going to be churning out 20 Viaplay documentaries a year. No, he's still going to be busy, even if he's not in Formula One. And also, he's about to become a dad. And speaking as a father of a 14-month-old at the moment, it changes you in many ways you can't possibly predict before you have a kid of your own. But make no mistake, these changes, oh, they're good changes. I feel like a much better person now becoming a dad. So it's reasonable to assume that Max may feel singled out and being attacked solely and specifically. But in reality, Verstappen isn't the first to feel boxed in via the actions of the current president. Him taking office after the fallout of Abu Dhabi 21, and calls for a meaningful change in the sport. For example, ever since he took office, Mr. Sullivan, Lewis Hamilton would publicly fret over whether his pride helmet or social messages might breach the vague new rules, him mentioning that ever since he first wore his rainbow-clad helmet in certain countries, initially the experience was nerve-wracking, but you did see it again in 2023, but then not in Qatar last year, save for when we saw it around the Spanish Grand Prix during Pride Month, when the rainbow-clad helmet did make a return. Then of course you got Sebastian Vettel, who is still really speaking out for changes that really speak out to his soul. You could argue that Sebastian was just simply not prepared to put up with any of what Mr. Sullivan was about to do. Maybe he felt like he could do more on his own outside the sport. whilst occasionally popping back in now and again to represent himself in the paddock. And I think this is a really, really clever move, because one perk of being an F1 world champion is that you get paddock access for life. So therefore, Sebastian can just rock up, come up with some kind of activity for the media to consume and digest to celebrate the sport or celebrate a campaign that he really believes in, and therefore just walk out again without seemingly any penalty, because otherwise it would make for bad optics. And that was really made evident by the fact that Nelson Piquet, another world champion, got his access revoked after making really derogatory comments toward Lewis Hamilton a couple of years ago. So Sebastian, oh, you clever so-and-so you. I hope that you do actually end up succeeding Helmut Marko as the chief of the Red Bull Junior division. You would be great. But the trend is clear. Vocal drivers are being used to show that the new code has teeth. Stewards don't have to target anyone by name. The scale and visibility of their examples are deterrent enough. Drivers these days are a lot more guarded or measured in their responses, now having to tippy-toe around matters on top of preparing for a race, or maybe even joking about it rather cynically. Now okay, the big question is this then. Is what is happening to Max and other F1 drivers a sign of blatant manipulation? Well, not exactly. If anyone's looking for a smoking gun conspiracy going on around here, there is none of that, I'm afraid. They have been told sometimes to keep their opinions to themselves, but that is a relatively professional way of saying, oh, just be quiet, just get on with the racing, okay? But nobody's been told to their face, oi, pipe down, or else you're gonna get a slap. What we're seeing in reality is simply a governance style that relies on high-profile examples to maintain control. The stewards aren't following Max around specifically with tape and scissors, or have their finger on a figurative Mad Max button, but they do cast long shadows across almost every series that may matter to him in the future. And not to mention, they have been empowered by Mr. Suliem to really speak out, show that strength, make use of their powers to dictate what goes on in a race, because they were, stewards, dragged through the mud considerably after Abu Dhabi 21, after what happened with Michael Massey, who is now still effectively in hiding, and still the butt of many jokes to this day, as well as many calls online for his head. But okay, let's be real. In reality, these rules are not out to silence individuals. Them just existing for drivers just to take in on their own, that's enough. Drivers are weighing the cost of speaking out with their prospects for the season. The last thing they want to have is potentially be docked points or banned from races for stuff that happened off the track. This isn't retreat from Max Verstappen, it's strategy. He's understanding how the game works, and therefore he's playing by that game. It's like, okay, if you don't like what I'm saying, then I won't say anything at all then. You can't punish me for being quiet, because again, Max really does know the F1 rulebook. There are not that many drivers on the grid that can exploit the rules as cleanly and as smartly as Max can. But it's clear that despite all of this, he has not forgotten about the values that got him into the sport. Just raw, honest racing. So far, that has not been affected. And with the arrival of Oscar Piastri, this might stoke the fires a little bit, that alongside Lando Norris and maybe Charles Leclerc and maybe George Russell, if they get their upgrades right, that there might be a huge ding-dong battle for the title that goes all the way to the end of the year. It's not Max leading by 20 seconds that he got used to in 2023, but maybe this close competition might fire him up to remain in the sport all the way through his Red Bull contract. But if that doesn't happen, and then you get even more red tape coming in, more examples of the FIA imposing their will, more examples of the stewards really coming down hard on drivers, not just Max specifically, then maybe the raw, honest racing aspect of F1 just may not be enough to keep him, that he'll just walk. And what also might be walking out the door are the hopes of Lando Norris retaining full leadership of McLaren this year. He must surely know that he is losing control right now, but I don't think it's over yet. But to find out why I think it is going to be an uphill battle for Lando to reassert his #1 status exclusively, watch this video next, straight after this one.